Thanks for watching Sweater Weather, a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network. Remember to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. And if you can, consider making a donation to the show over at our website, sweaterweatherpod.com. So, there has been at different times a cultural fascination with taxi drivers. In the book you mentioned, and you mentioned in our interview, Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver, the sitcom Taxi, with Danny DeVito and Judd Hirsch. Anyone who hasn't seen those old episodes, it's a good show.
Good show.
Uh, yeah. And there's a kind of a less known novel. It's called Taxi by Helen Potrabenko, who was a female cab driver in Vancouver in the 70s. And it seems to me that maybe the 70s was a high point for cultural interest in taxi drivers. And it's probably safe to say that this job doesn't have the same visibility in arts and culture as it once did. I don't know if that seems right to you or not. Your book is obviously going against this trend. But do you have a sense of maybe why the cab driver would find less cultural representation now than it once did?
Well, look at the people you mentioned: Helen Potrabenko, Robert De Niro, and the cast of Taxi were all white. They represent a time when the industry. They represent a time right before the industry started becoming an industry for immigrant workers, which it is now. Right? I mean, the something.
Or immigrants of color?
That's what I mean. That's
Yeah,
what I
yeah.
mean. Before the 70s and early 80s, the taxi industry looked a lot different than it does now. It was white men and women driving cabs, and now it mostly isn't, as we know. And I think that might have something to do with it. I mean, even the show Taxi, the the only immigrant in that whole show was also white, and he wasn't even, it was Andy Kaufman's Latka, and he was also a white guy.
Yeah, he plays what is he? Yeah, what is his character? I can't remember.
Like he's some maybe
He's weird. Like
some
his
weird
character is that he's a weird guy.
from some
Yeah.
fictional Eastern European country, something
Oh,
like that.
okay. It's
Yeah.
fiction. Okay. Yeah.
I believe so. I don't think he came from any real place. That accent was not familiar to anyone. Um, so yeah, I think what changed after that is the taxi industry really became a job for it's an immigrant job. It's a kind of job that immigrants do. And let's face it, that those kinds of jobs are not held in typically in high regard in Canada, right? Um, I write a chapter about Rawi Hodge, who drove cab in Montreal and did a lot of you know immigrant jobs. He worked in a factory in New York. He drove cab in Montreal, and when
And Rawi Hodge is just for the audience who may not know, he's a celebrated Canadian author
right,
now,
right,
winner of the like maybe one of the world's biggest literary prizes, the Impact Dublin Literary Award.
yeah, it was the biggest at
He's
the time, at
written,
least it might still be. But yeah,
yeah.
but he was driving. He wrote his Impact Dublin award-winning novel called De Niro's Game, interesting enough, while he was driving cab in Montreal. And when that book hit, when it became such a success, journalists would describe Rowie as the immigrant who made it, which is a problematic. I think is problematic praise, because it's the idea that you make it. An immigrant who makes it is an immigrant who stops doing jobs that immigrants do, right? If you become a novelist, you've made it. But I look at some of the other drivers in the book who are still driving, who have supported their families, who put their kids through school, who survived in wars and escaped terrible trauma and deprivation. Haven't they made it? We don't say that they've made it because they're still driving cab. So I think I've drifted away from your original question, but I think there is a sense that I think part of the reason why the cab driver is not such a common character, a celebrated character in contemporary culture, is because it's a job that the society at large diminishes, that feels is not to be celebrated. I had one cabbie tell me that often his passengers treat him as if he's a part of the car. right? You know, this idea, these are the invisible men and women that drive us around, and they don't get a lot of respect. And you look what's happened now with the rideshare apps. Although if I said rideshare to any of these guys, they would lose it because they know they're being shared, they're being paid for. But these ride for hire apps, those, you know, so many citizens of of Calgary and everywhere else who love Uber will will talk about Uber. You know, they're they don't consider Uber a problem because to hell with the cab drivers. If that industry can't survive, then it can't survive. There's no, we don't value those men and women behind the wheel in the same way that maybe we used to. I don't know if it's romantic anymore. You know, I don't. You know, I think, you know, it's there's something about that too.
Yeah, I mean, those, like, say, certainly Taxi Driver, there's a whole romantic element to that character. Kind of lone wolf, out there at night. He's, famously psychologically disturbed, but he's kind of oddly redeemed through, what happens in that. I think there's something about the 70s too. Like, yeah, certainly you mentioned that these are just jobs that are not valued in our society. And so that's reflected in, their working conditions as well as their kind of cultural visibility or invisibility.
Mhm.
But there, when you look at the 70s too, yeah, there was a big difference in, who drivers were, like, racially. Yeah. And also, I think, like, the 70s, there was a tendency to portray the working class a little bit more. I think the culture of that era and a little bit earlier had sort of a larger role for, like, working class people and characters. And in the 70s, a lot of that changes, and I think that's partly just because of the economic and the really kind of the large historical forces that are changing our
Mhm.
economy. And one of the things they're doing is increasingly devaluing working class jobs. So attacking unions,
Yeah.
just kind of rhetorically, saying, working class people get paid too much. That's why we have the economic problems that they had in the 70s, like inflation, for example. So there's a whole cultural shift, I think, that begins in the 70s around the working class that I think it leads us to a place where, yeah, working class characters like cab drivers also get, kind of, we lose sight of them in the cultural realm a little bit more.
It's funny
So,
you bring
yeah.
that up because you know, early on, you know, the manuscript I delivered to my editor was not the manuscript that he thought he was going to get. And I think what you're talking about here about the socioeconomic state of the industry, how it's changed, where it's at now, all of those things, all the business side of it, was something that I was far less interested in than the lives of the drivers themselves, right? Which I think is quite clear in our interview and in the book. You know, it's their life stories that I'm fascinated with. I was far less interested in taxi driving than I was with taxi drivers. Um, um, but I think, you know, when I delivered my kind of my first draft to the my editor, he was surprised that there wasn't the stuff that you're talking about now, the that it wasn't there, at least not as much as he thought it would be. So that, you know, maybe that's an entirely different book that someone much smarter than me could write about all of that. Um, but yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because that's something that I didn't avoid, but something that I didn't focus on when I was writing the book. It's not my
Oh, I mean,
area of expertise.
well, I mean, I'm so glad you wrote the book you did. I mean, that other stuff, where did I learn that? In other books?
Yeah,
So,
sure.
you didn't need to write that book. The book you wrote is beautiful. It's called Driven: the Secret Lives of Taxi Drivers. Is that right? The subtitle.
Yes.
It's a beautiful book. I highly recommend that you read it. And thank you again, Marcello, for talking to me today.
Oh, thanks so much, Aaron. This was great.